In the middle of a blinding snowstorm that shut down every highway through the mountains, Darius Wright, a black single dad in his 40s, stood alone inside an abandoned rest stop with less than $40 in his wallet and a foreclosure notice burned into his mind. He had nothing, no wife, no future, no way out. Then a black luxury sedan pulled off the road and stopped. A woman stepped out. Her voice was hoarse from the cold. She said only one thing: "We need shelter, please." Darius didn't know who she was. He didn't know that opening the door would change everything for both of them. The rest stop had been closed for over 2 years before Darius Wright moved in. The owner, an old man named Gerald, who lived 3 towns over, had offered him a deal after Darius's divorce left him with nothing but a bag of clothes and a toolbox. Watch the place, keep the pipes from freezing, make sure nobody strips the copper wire from the walls. In return, Darius could sleep in the back office, use the water, and pretend he still had an address. It wasn't charity, Gerald had said. It was just cheaper than hiring a security company. Darius took the deal because he had no other option, and because saying yes to something, anything, felt better than saying no to everything. As a black man who'd already watched his life get quietly erased by paperwork and past due notices, he knew how fast the world forgot you once your name slipped off a lease. Before the divorce, Darius had run a small engine repair shop just off Route 9. He was good with machines, always had been. The kind of man who could listen to an engine idle and tell you exactly which part was dying. For 12 years, the shop paid the bills, kept his son fed, kept the lights on. Then he made the mistake of expanding. He took a loan to lease a bigger space, bought equipment he didn't need, hired 2 guys he couldn't afford. Within 18 months, the shop bled out. The bank took the building, the creditors took everything else. His son, now 23 and living in Denver, stopped calling after the second time Darius couldn't make rent on his own apartment. It wasn't anger, it was something worse. It was distance. Now, Darius lived in the back of a rest stop off a mountain highway that saw maybe 10 cars a day in good weather and none when the snow came. He had a space heater that ran on a generator he kept fed with whatever fuel he could afford. He had a cot, a small refrigerator, and a radio that pulled in 2 stations. One country, one static. The foreclosure notice had arrived 6 days ago, forwarded from an address he no longer lived at. It informed him in language that felt almost polite that his remaining debt had been transferred to a collection agency and that his independent contractor license was under review pending resolution. He read it once, folded it, and put it in the glove compartment of his truck. He hadn't opened it since. The night the storm hit, Darius was sitting in the main room of the rest stop, the old waiting area, with its cracked tile floor and plastic chairs bolted to metal rails, eating canned soup heated on a portable burner. The radio had warned about the snowstorm since morning, but the forecast said it would pass south. It didn't. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the wind came first, slamming against the windows hard enough to rattle the frames. Then the snow followed, not falling, but driving sideways, thick and blinding, like something alive and furious. Within an hour, the highway was buried. The power, which was already unreliable, flickered twice and then gave up entirely. Darius switched on the generator and sat in the yellow glow of a single work lamp, listening to the world outside disappear. His dark brown hands, cracked from years of engine grease and cold air, wrapped around the warm mug of soup as if it were the only steady thing in his life. He didn't expect anyone. The road had been empty for hours. The state patrol had probably closed the exits miles back. So when he heard the engine muffled, struggling, he stood up and looked through the front window and saw nothing but white. Then headlights cut through the snow, weak and low, and a black sedan crawled into the rest stop parking lot like an animal looking for a place to die. It stopped at an angle, the rear tires sliding slightly on the ice. The engine shut off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the rear passenger door opened and a woman stepped out into the storm. She was wearing a dark wool coat that probably cost more than everything Darius owned combined. Her hair, silver blonde and cropped short, was already wet with snow. She walked toward the rest stop entrance without hesitation, as if she had decided before the car even stopped that this was where she was going. Behind her, the driver's door opened, and a broad-shouldered man in a black jacket stepped out, squinting against the wind. He didn't follow her right away. He stood by the car, one hand on the roof, looking at the building like he was calculating whether it was safe. Darius met her at the front door. She looked at him the way people look at things they don't understand yet, not with fear, but with a fast, precise kind of assessment. She took in the tall black man in a worn flannel shirt and work boots, standing guard over a place the world had forgotten. Her face was pale from the cold, her lips almost blue. She didn't introduce herself, she didn't explain. She said, "We need shelter, please." And her voice cracked on the last word, not from emotion, but from the raw air tearing at her throat. Darius looked past her at the sedan, at the driver still standing in the snow, at the storm swallowing the highway behind them. He thought about the generator, which had maybe 6 hours of fuel left. He thought about the canned food he had rationed to last through the week. He thought about the fact that he didn't know these people, that the woman's coat alone made him feel like he was standing on the wrong side of a window, looking in at a life he'd never have. He thought about the door and how easy it would be to say the place was closed, condemned, unsafe, all of which were technically true. But Darius Wright had grown up in a town where people plowed each other's driveways without being asked. His father, a black man who'd spent his life fixing other people's problems with his own two hands, had once driven 40 miles in a thunderstorm to pull a stranger's car out of a ditch. And when Darius asked him why, the old man had said, "Because nobody should sit in the dark alone if somebody can help it." That was 25 years ago. Darius's father was dead now. The town was half empty. The world had changed, but that sentence had stayed lodged somewhere between his ribs, like a splinter he never wanted to remove. He stepped aside and held the door open. "It's not much," he said. "The generator's running, but I can't promise how long. There's no heat except what the space heater puts out. No food except what I've got in cans." He looked at the woman. "But you're welcome to stay until the road opens." The woman stepped inside without thanking him. Not out of rudeness, Darius could tell the difference. It was the way someone moves when they're too cold and too tired for manners, when survival temporarily outranks everything else. Her driver followed a minute later, stomping snow from his boots, carrying a leather bag and a phone that he kept checking even though there was clearly no signal. He introduced himself as Ray, shook Darius's hand with a firm grip, and immediately began assessing the space, exits, windows, structural integrity with the trained eye of someone who had been paid to keep people safe for a long time. Lillian Moore, though Darius wouldn't learn her full name until later, sat down in one of the plastic chairs and stared at the space heater as if it were a fireplace. The orange glow reflected in her eyes, and for a moment she looked almost human in a way that contradicted everything about her appearance. The coat, the posture, the precision of her movements, all of it said control. But her eyes in that first quiet minute said something else entirely. They said exhaustion, not the kind you fix with sleep. The kind that accumulates over years of making decisions that cost other people things you never have to see. Darius brought her a cup of instant coffee heated on the burner, served in a chipped ceramic mug that said, "World's Okayest Dad." A gift from his son, given as a joke during a Christmas that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life, back when his boy still believed his black dad could fix anything with a wrench and a smile. She took it with both hands and drank without asking what was in it. Ray declined the coffee, but accepted a bottle of water and positioned himself near the front window, watching the storm like a man who didn't trust the weather to stay outside. None of them spoke much in those first minutes. The wind filled the silence well enough. Darius sat across from the woman, close enough to be available, but far enough to give her space. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she was going. He had learned in the months since his life collapsed that people who end up in places like this don't want questions. They want walls, a roof, and the quiet understanding that nobody is going to make them explain how they got there. Outside, the snow kept falling. The highway was gone, not closed, but erased, as if it had never existed. The temperature was dropping fast. Darius checked the generator, calculated the fuel, and decided that if he turned off the overhead light and relied only on the work lamp, he could stretch it until morning. He made the adjustment without mentioning it. The room dimmed, the space heater hummed, and 3 strangers sat in a half-dead rest stop on a mountain. Nobody was coming to rescue them. Each was carrying a version of ruin they hadn't yet said out loud. By midnight, the storm had settled into a steady, grinding assault. Not the violent bursts of the first hours, but a constant low roar that pressed against the walls of the rest stop like something testing for weakness. The temperature inside had dropped enough that Darius could see his own breath when he stood more than 5 feet from the space heater. He dragged a second chair closer to the heater for Lillian and offered her a wool blanket he kept folded on his cot. She accepted it without protest, wrapping it around her shoulders with the efficiency of someone who understood that pride was a luxury the cold didn't respect. Ray had made himself useful in the way that men like him always did, quietly, without asking permission. He checked every door and window, found a draft coming through a cracked seal on the back exit, and stuffed it with rags from a supply closet Darius had forgotten existed. Then he'd gone back to his post near the front window, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, arms crossed, eyes half closed, but never fully shut. Darius recognized the posture. It was the way you sat when you'd spent most of your life being responsible for someone else's safety. When rest was something you did in layers, never all at once. The woman, she still hadn't given her name, sat in the plastic chair with her legs crossed and the blanket pulled tight. Her phone was on her lap, dark and useless. Darius noticed she kept glancing at it, not to check for a signal, but almost out of habit. The way someone reaches for something that has always been there and suddenly isn't. Everything about her suggested a person who was used to controlling her environment. The way she held her coffee, the way she scanned the room when she thought nobody was watching, the way she gave instructions to Ray in short, precise sentences that weren't rude but left no room for debate. She was a woman who made decisions for a living, and being stuck in a place where she couldn't make any was clearly something her body didn't know how to process. Darius, on the other hand, had become very good at sitting still. Months of living in this rest stop had taught him that silence wasn't emptiness, it was just a different kind of full. As a black man alone on a forgotten stretch of highway, he'd gotten used to being invisible until something broke. He sat across from her, close enough to share the heater's warmth, and worked on a small transistor radio he'd been trying to fix for weeks. His hands moved steadily, stripping wire, twisting connectors, testing frequencies. It was the kind of work that kept his mind from wandering into the places he didn't want it to go. The debt, the notice, the son who didn't call. "You live here?" It wasn't a question. Lillian said it while looking at the cot visible through the half-open office door, at the line of canned goods on the shelf, at the toothbrush standing in a coffee can near the sink. Her voice was flat, not unkind, but observational, the way someone reads data from a spreadsheet. Darius didn't look up from the radio. "I keep the place from falling apart. The owner lets me stay." He said it the way he'd practiced saying it casually, as if it were an arrangement he'd chosen rather than one he'd fallen into. He could feel her looking at him, measuring the distance between what he said and what was obviously true. And he kept his hands busy because that was the only way to keep the conversation from going where he didn't want it to. Lillian pulled the blanket tighter. "I run a company," she said. "Renewable energy, solar and wind mostly. We have contracts in 14 states. She delivered the information like a resume, but Darius heard something underneath it. Not pride, but defense. She was telling him who she was because the room had stripped away every visible marker of it. Without her car, her phone, her schedule, her name on a building, she was just a woman in a cold room wrapped in a stranger's blanket. And that, Darius suspected, terrified her more than the storm. He nodded but didn't respond with anything about himself. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the generator and the wind outside. Darius twisted a wire on the radio and got a burst of static, then nothing. He set it down and leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights were off, and the work lamp cast long shadows that made the room feel smaller than it was, almost intimate in a way that neither of them had agreed to. 14 states, Darius said after a while, not mockingly, but with the quiet weight of someone doing math in his head. That's a lot of territory to manage. Lillian looked at him as if she was deciding whether the comment was genuine or a setup. It is, she said. And right now, every one of those contracts is sitting on a table in a conference room in Hartford waiting for me to show up and explain why our third quarter projections fell short by 22%. She said it the way you confess something to a stranger at a bar, not because you trust them, but because you know you'll never see them again. The storm had made the rest stop into a confessional, and the rules of the outside world didn't apply here. Darius understood that feeling. He'd spent enough time alone to know that sometimes the only person you could be honest with was someone who had no power over your life. So when the conversation drifted slowly, without either of them steering it toward the things they carried, he didn't fight it. It started with small things. Lillian mentioned that she hadn't eaten since breakfast, and that the breakfast had been a protein bar in the backseat of the car. Darius heated a second can of soup, chicken noodle, the same brand he'd been eating for weeks, and handed it to her in the same chipped mug. She ate slowly without complaint, and somewhere in the middle of that quiet meal, the distance between them began to close. Not because they had anything in common, but because hunger and cold don't care about tax brackets or job titles. They reduce everyone to the same basic needs. And meeting those needs for each other creates a kind of equality that no boardroom or bank statement can replicate. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the generator coughed twice and then steadied. Darius checked the fuel level and calculated that they had maybe 4 hours left. He told Lillian and Ray without drama, just the facts, just the timeline. Ray suggested they could siphon fuel from the sedan, and Darius said he had a hand pump in the back. The two men went outside into the storm, worked in the dark for 15 minutes, and came back with enough diesel to buy them until noon. It was practical, wordless cooperation. The kind that happens when people stop performing their roles and just do what needs to be done. When Darius came back inside, hands red and numb against his warm brown skin, Lillian was standing near the shelf where he kept his few personal belongings. She wasn't touching anything, just looking. Her eyes moved over the foreclosure notice he'd left, folded next to a stack of paperbacks, the one he thought he'd hidden well enough. She didn't mention it, but when he sat back down, something in her face had changed. The assessment was gone. In its place was something closer to recognition. The look of someone who realizes the ground they're standing on is no more stable than the ground beneath the person across from them. "My son thinks I chose the company over him," Lillian said. The statement arrived without introduction, connected to nothing they'd been discussing, as if it had been sitting behind her teeth for hours and finally slipped out. He's 31, lives in Portland, works for a nonprofit that builds affordable housing. He hasn't spoken to me in 2 years. She looked at Darius directly. "He says I don't know how to see people, only numbers." Darius felt the words land in a place he hadn't expected. His own son was 23, living in Denver, and the last time they'd spoken was a 4-minute phone call 3 months ago that ended with his boy saying, "I just don't know what to say to you anymore, Dad." Darius hadn't told anyone about that call. He didn't tell Lillian either, but something about the way she said it, flat, clinical, the way you describe a wound you've stopped trying to heal, made him feel like she'd understand if he did. "I had a repair shop," Darius said. He wasn't sure why he was talking. The words came out slowly, carefully, like he was testing each one before letting it go. 12 years. Did good work, steady. Then I got it in my head that bigger was better. Took a loan I couldn't carry, hired people I couldn't pay. He stared at the space heater, watching the coils glow orange. Lost the shop, lost the house, lost the marriage. Now I'm looking at losing my contractor's license because the debt went to collections and there's a review process that I can't afford a lawyer to fight. He let out a breath that wasn't a sigh, but something heavier. Something that carried the full weight of admitting to a stranger what he'd been unable to admit to himself. "I'm broke. Not struggling. Broke. The kind of broke where you count cans of soup and call it budgeting." Lillian didn't offer sympathy. She didn't say she was sorry or that things would get better. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that Darius could only describe as honest. "I'm sitting on a company worth $400 million on paper," she said, And 3 weeks ago, I approved a restructuring plan that eliminated 215 jobs in communities that had no other employer. I did it because the numbers made sense. I didn't visit a single one of those towns. I didn't look at a single name on the list. Her jaw tightened. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss my leadership. What they're actually discussing is whether I've become a liability. And the answer is yes. Not because I made bad decisions, because I made decisions that were technically correct and completely wrong. The room felt different after that. Not warmer, not safer, but stripped, like two people who had taken off armor they didn't know they were wearing. Darius understood in that moment that he and this woman were not as different as the surface suggested. He was bankrupt in the way the world measures money, credit, professional standing. She was bankrupt in the way that doesn't show on a balance sheet: empathy, connection, the basic human ability to see the cost of your choices in someone else's face. Both of them had lost things they couldn't buy back, and both of them were sitting in a cold room, pretending they still had time to fix it. They didn't talk much after that. The storm continued. Ray dozed by the window. Darius and Lillian sat in the glow of the space heater, two people who had accidentally told each other the truth and now had to figure out how to exist in the same room with that knowledge. It was uncomfortable in the way that honesty always is, not because it hurts, but because it removes the option of pretending. By morning, the snow had slowed. Gray light crept through the windows, and the parking lot outside was buried under 2 feet of white. The highway was still impassable, but the wind had died down enough that the world felt navigable again. Ray was outside clearing snow from the sedan with a scraper he'd found in Darius's truck. Lillian was standing by the window watching him work when her phone, which she'd placed on the windowsill hours ago, suddenly lit up. A single bar of signal, fragile and temporary, but enough. It buzzed 3 times in quick succession. She picked it up and read the messages with a face that didn't move. Darius was cleaning up the cans and mugs when he heard her voice go quiet in a way he hadn't heard before. She was on the phone, standing near the back of the room, speaking in short, clipped sentences that he couldn't fully make out. But the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of someone being told something they already knew but hadn't been ready to hear out loud. When she hung up, she stood still for a long time, staring at the phone in her hand like it was a thing that had betrayed her. "The board voted this morning," she said without turning around. "Preliminary vote, advisory, not binding, but the signal is clear. They want me out." Her voice was steady, but Darius could hear the fracture underneath. Not in the words, but in the spaces between them. 23 years I built that company, and they did it over a conference call while I was stuck in a rest stop on a mountain. Darius didn't know what to say to that. He had no frame of reference for losing a $400 million company, but he knew what it felt like to have something you built, with your hands taken away by people who'd never touched it. And that was close enough. He stood by the counter, dish towel in his hand, and said the only honest thing he could think of. "I'm sorry." Lillian turned and looked at him, and in that look, Darius saw something shift. She was seeing him differently now. Not as a black man in a forgotten rest stop, not as a charity case, but as the only person in her current world who had treated her like a human being instead of a position. And with that recognition came something Darius hadn't anticipated. She said, "Let me help you." The words hit him like cold water. He felt his chest tighten, not with gratitude, but with something closer to alarm, because he understood instantly and completely what was happening. She had the power to make a phone call and clear his debt, to connect him with lawyers who could save his license, to write a check that would pull him out of the hole he'd been drowning in for months. And she was offering it now, in this room, after he'd fed her soup and given her a blanket and opened a door he could have kept closed. The math was simple. The kindness had a price tag now, and Darius couldn't afford to accept it. "No," he said. The word came out harder than he intended. He set the towel down and looked at her directly. "I didn't open that door so you'd owe me something. And I'm not going to take your money so you can feel better about the 200 people who lost their jobs." He regretted the last sentence the moment it left his mouth, but he didn't take it back because it was true, and because taking it back would have been a different kind of dishonesty. Lillian's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes closed. She nodded once, slowly, and turned back to the window. Ray came inside and announced that the highway might open within the hour. Lillian picked up her coat from the chair, folded the blanket Darius had given her, and placed it neatly on the seat. She thanked him formally, correctly, the way you thank a hotel concierge, and walked toward the door. Ray carried the leather bag and followed her without a word. Darius stood in the doorway and watched them get into the sedan. The engine started on the first try. The tires found traction on the packed snow, and the black car pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the mountain road, leaving nothing behind but tire tracks that the next snowfall would erase. Lillian Moore drove away carrying the weight of 2 failures, one public, one private. She couldn't save her company, and she couldn't save the one person who had seen her as something other than a title. The rest stop was quiet again. Darius closed the door and stood in the empty room, looking at the folded blanket, the chipped mug, the space where a stranger had sat and accidentally become something more. He picked up the foreclosure notice from the shelf where he'd left it and read it again, all the way through this time. Then he folded it and put it back. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. And he was alone again, which was exactly what he'd chosen. The letter from the state licensing board arrived 11 days after the storm. It came in a plain white envelope with a return address Darius had been dreading for months. And he opened it standing next to his truck in the rest stop parking lot because he didn't want to read it inside the building where he slept. The language was formal and final. His independent contractor license had been suspended, effective immediately pending full resolution of outstanding debts. The review board noted his failure to respond within the required 30-day window and his inability to provide proof of financial remediation. In plain terms, it meant Darius could no longer legally work as a mechanic. The one skill that had defined him for his entire adult life, the thing his hands knew how to do better than anything else, had been taken away by a process he didn't have the money to fight. He folded the letter and stood in the cold, looking at the mountains. The snow from the storm had mostly melted on the road, but still clung to the higher elevations, white and indifferent. He thought about calling his son. He picked up his phone and scrolled to the number and stared at it for a long time, but he couldn't think of what he would say. "I lost my license, didn't capture it. I have nothing left" was closer, but it sounded like a plea. And Darius had decided somewhere along the way that he would not become a man who begged his own child for comfort. So he put the phone away and went back inside and sat on the cot and did nothing, because there was nothing left to do. 300 miles southeast in a glass-walled conference room in Hartford, Lillian Moore sat at the head of a table she had sat at for over 2 decades and listened to the board of directors explain in measured and diplomatic language why her continued leadership was no longer in the best interest of the company. The formal vote was scheduled for the following week, but the outcome was already decided. She could see it in their faces. The careful avoidance of eye contact, the rehearsed sympathy, the way they addressed her as Lillian instead of Miss Moore, as if softening the name would soften the blade. She had built this company from a 3-person office in a rented space above a hardware store. She had secured the first contract, signed the first client, survived the first recession, and now she was being removed from it the same way she had removed 215 employees from their jobs 3 weeks ago, efficiently, legally, and without anyone looking her in the eye. After the meeting, Lillian sat alone in her car in the parking garage beneath the building. Ray was in the driver's seat waiting for instructions, but she didn't give any. She stared at her phone, scrolling through contacts, hundreds of names, industry leaders, politicians, lawyers, investors, and realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that there was not a single person in that list she could call. Not to talk, not to be honest with, not to say, I don't know what to do next. Every relationship in her phone was transactional. Every connection was contingent on her being the person at the top of the letterhead. Without the title, she was a stranger to all of them. The only person who had spoken to her honestly in recent memory was a broke black mechanic in a rest stop who had told her the truth to her face and then let her leave. She thought about what Darius had said about the 215 people, about kindness not being currency. The words had stung when he said them, and they still stung now. But not because they were cruel, because they were accurate. She had offered him help the way she offered everything. As a transaction, a favor with an invisible ledger attached. And he had seen through it instantly, the way people who have nothing left can see through people who have everything except the one thing that matters. Lillian told Ray to drive. She didn't tell him where. He pulled out of the garage and merged onto the highway heading north, and she watched the city shrink behind them without saying a word. It took nearly 5 hours to reach the mountain highway. The road was clear now, patched with salt and sand, and the rest stop appeared around a bend, looking exactly as she remembered. Small, worn, unremarkable, the kind of place you pass without noticing unless you have no other choice. Ray pulled into the lot and stopped the car. Lillian got out and walked to the front door and knocked. Darius opened it. He looked at her the way you look at something you've already filed away as finished. Surprise, then confusion, then a slow, cautious recognition that the story wasn't over yet. He didn't say anything. He just stood in the doorway in a flannel shirt and work boots, holding a wrench he'd been using on the generator, and waited for her to explain why she was standing on his doorstep again. "I'm not here as a CEO," Lillian said. She stood straight, but her voice was different from the last time, not commanding, not clinical, but level in the way someone speaks when they've rehearsed nothing and are relying entirely on what's true. "I'm probably not going to be a CEO much longer. The board is voting next week, and I already know the result." She looked at the rest stop behind him, at the dim light inside, at the life he was barely holding together. "I'm here because you were right. What I offered you before was not help. It was a reflex. It was me doing what I always do, solving a problem with money, so I don't have to feel anything about it." Darius leaned against the doorframe. He didn't invite her in, not yet. He studied her face the way he studied machines, looking for the part that wasn't working, the thing that was out of alignment. "So, what are you here for?" he asked. Lillian reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out to him. "Before the board makes their decision, I set aside a portion of my personal equity to fund a project outside the company. Small-scale solar panel installation and maintenance for rural communities that can't afford commercial contracts. It's legitimate, it's registered, and it's mine, not the company's." She kept her hand extended. "I need someone who knows machines, who knows how to fix things, who can work with small teams in places that most contractors won't drive to. I'm not offering you charity, Darius. I'm offering you a job, a real one, with a contract, fair pay, and no strings." Darius didn't take the paper. He looked at it, then at her, then at the mountains behind her, where the snow was still melting. He thought about the letter from the licensing board sitting on the shelf inside. He thought about the canned soup and the generator and the cot where he slept every night in a building that belonged to someone else. He thought about his father, who drove 40 miles in a thunderstorm to pull a stranger out of a ditch, and who never once asked for anything in return. But his father had also never turned down honest work when it was offered honestly. "If I do this," Darius said, "it's because the work makes sense. Not because of what happened during the storm, not because you feel guilty, and not because I need saving." His voice was firm, but not hard. It was the voice of a man drawing a line, not building a wall. Lillian nodded. "I understand." Darius took the paper. He unfolded it and read it, standing in the doorway. It was a project brief, scope, timeline, locations, compensation. It was clean, professional, and fair. There was no mention of the storm, no mention of favors, no mention of anything except the work itself, and that more than anything else she could have said, told Darius that she meant it. The project launched 2 months later. It was small, 3 rural counties, a handful of installations, a team of 5 including Darius. The work was hard and unglamorous. They drove dirt roads in trucks loaded with panels and wiring, set up systems on rooftops that hadn't seen maintenance in years, and spent long days in the sun doing the kind of physical labor that Darius's body remembered even when his mind had forgotten. He was good at it, better than good. He had spent his whole life understanding how things worked, and solar panels were just another machine, complex on paper, simple in practice, responsive to the same patient attention he'd given every engine he'd ever fixed. Lillian visited the sites occasionally, but she didn't hover. She handled the business side, permits, contracts, funding, and she did it differently than before. She learned the names of the families whose homes they worked on. She sat at kitchen tables and drank bad coffee and listened to people talk about their electric bills and their worries and their kids. She didn't fix those things, she just listened. And for a woman who had spent 23 years looking at spreadsheets instead of faces, that was the closest thing to a revolution she had ever experienced. The board voted as expected. Lillian was removed as CEO, but by the time the decision was formalized, she had already stepped into something else, something smaller, less powerful, and infinitely more real. The rural solar project grew, not into an empire, but into a sustainable operation that employed 12 people and served communities that the bigger companies had written off as unprofitable. Lillian ran it without a corner office, without a board, without anyone calling her Miss Moore in a tone that meant something other than her name. Darius got his license reinstated. The contract work provided enough income to resolve his outstanding debts, and a lawyer Lillian connected him with, at his request, not hers, navigated the review process. It took 4 months. When the letter came confirming the reinstatement, Darius read it at the same spot in the parking lot where he'd read the suspension notice. He folded it and put it in his pocket and went back to work. He didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. What he felt was something quieter than relief. It was the sensation of standing on solid ground again after a long time spent falling. He moved out of the rest stop eventually, found a small rental near one of the project sites. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom with a kitchen and a porch that looked out at an open land. He called his son on a Tuesday evening, not because he had good news to share, but because he wanted to hear his voice. The conversation lasted 12 minutes longer than any call they'd had in over a year. His son didn't say much, but he didn't hang up early either. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a door opened a crack with light coming through. Lillian and Darius never became friends in the way most people understand the word. They didn't share meals or call each other on holidays or talk about their feelings. What they had was something more durable, mutual respect, grounded in a night when both of them had been stripped of everything they used to hide behind and had chosen, despite every reason not to be honest. Darius had opened a door in a storm because his father taught him that nobody should sit in the dark alone. Lillian had come back because Darius taught her that help means nothing if it comes from above. The rest stop still stands on that mountain highway. Gerald never sold it. Darius still checks on it sometimes, drives up on a weekend and makes sure the pipes haven't frozen, the windows haven't cracked. He doesn't sleep there anymore, but he keeps the world's okayest dad mug on the shelf where it's always been, next to the space where the foreclosure notice used to sit. The notice is gone now. The mug stays. Some things you lose, some things you keep. And sometimes, on a night when the world shuts down and all the roads are closed, the only thing that saves you is a stranger who has nothing to offer except a door that opens from the inside.